Hey everyone, I'm Brian Varnell with Varnell Retro and Vintage Collections, and on today's episode of the James Bond Jr. podcast, I'll be talking about episode 2, Earthcracker, and issue number 3 of the James Bond Jr. Marvel comic, also entitled Earthcracker. Now, before I get into the episode, I want to go a little bit into the behind the scenes. This episode is written by Mel Gilden. He also wrote for other cartoon shows like He-Man, The Little Shop of Horrors animated series, and The Mask animated series. Besides being a writer of cartoon shows, he's also an original novelist. He's written such books as Britney Spears is a Three-Headed Alien, Harry Newberry and the Raiders of the Red Drink. He also wrote books that were adaptations of TV shows and movies, including those for Star Trek Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. He wrote for the 90210 book series, which I never knew existed. And one I found really interesting, he did the novelization for Disney's live-action Jungle Book movie in the 90s, which, if you haven't seen it, it's really good, and a lot of the scenes from the movie terrified me as a kid. This episode saw the introduction of Goldfinger and Oddjob to the show. Goldfinger was voiced by Jan Rabson, who also voiced Gordo Lighter. Oddjob was voiced by Jeff Burnett, who also voices IQ. Now, much like Oddjob in the film, outside of a few laughs and growls, Oddjob doesn't speak. Now, what I liked about this episode is that it doesn't take place right after the first episode. You can tell that some time has passed, and they've been on a few adventures since we've last seen them. Story starts off and we see James Bond Jr., IQ, Tracy, and Trevor out exploring the Warfield Academy grounds with a new student, Lota. Lota is created strictly for this episode. She doesn't appear in the series going forward. As they're exploring, Oddjob appears in a tank and kidnaps Lotta. Trevor tries to run away but ends up falling down a cliff and hits his head. James Bond Jr. tries to stop Oddjob from taking Lotta, but before he can, Oddjob throws his hat towards him, causing James Bond Jr. to stop in his tracks. Oddjob, when he throws his hat, he doesn't go back to get it. He just gets in his tank and drives away. But later on in the episode, we see him again wearing a hat, which means Oddjob must have a storage full of his hats just laying around. James Bond Jr. is able to track Oddjob back to an airfield where he sees that they're getting on a plane to Peru. Now, this is very significant because Lotta's father is actually a researcher in Peru who is looking for the lost city of gold, El Dorado. Tracy tells the group that Lotta had mentioned to her that her father had gone missing, which makes James Bond Jr. think that there might be a connection with her kidnapping and her father's disappearance. Much like many of the female leads in the James Bond films, their names have a double meaning. Lotta and her father's last name is Dinero, which is Spanish for money. James Bond Jr. also gets some new gadgets in this episode from IQ. A grappling hook with a very strong rope gets added onto his watch. IQ gives him a video camera that's actually a gold detector, and the batteries are grenades. Now, the way you can tell that this episode is not taking place right after the first one is because James Bond Jr. makes a comment to IQ saying that he hopes that these gadgets work because the last ones he's been using haven't been effective. And of course, IQ takes offense to it and they have some back and forth, very similar to what Q and Bond would have in the film. But the one thing that James Bond Jr. mentions is that IQ didn't give him anything to protect him from Oddjob's flying hat, which is really the one thing he really needs. It then dawns on James Bond Jr. and IQ that if Oddjob was the kidnapper, that must mean that Goldfinger is behind it. Now, Goldfinger in this show is German, he has a German accent, but he dresses more like Van Pelt from Jumanji than like a golfer like in the film. James Bond Jr., IQ, and Tracy are able to escape Warfield Academy and make their way to Peru, which does seem a little bit odd because when they get to Peru, they say it took them about 3 days, but it never mentions how they got there. I really would have liked something similar to an Indiana Jones plane map sequence here, just to give us some retrospect of how they got there. All three of them are on horseback, and that's when Bond makes a joke calling his horse Moneypenny, which of course was M's assistant in the James Bond films. James Bond Jr. then uses his gold detector camera and finds out that there are signs of gold down in a nearby village. So while he goes and tracks down the signal, Tracy and IQ go down to the town and they end up arriving at the El Dorado Hotel, and that's when they learn about a giant cannon that's over the mountain. Sometime after that, the earth begins to shake, and we get a weird cutscene. We see IQ in a bathtub for no reason whatsoever. It's just really weird, and it makes no sense, and Tracy even ends up running into the bathroom trying to see if IQ's okay. It's just a really weird scene, and I'm not sure why they included it in this episode. Meanwhile, back at the Academy, Trevor, who's played by Simon Templeman, who also voiced Doctor Doom in the 90s Fantastic Four series. He was the Angel of Death on the original Charm series, and he voiced Kane in the Legacy of Kane video game series. Trevor has gone to the headmaster to tell him that James Bond Jr., IQ, and his daughter have gone to Peru to track down the lost city of gold. I don't know how Trevor knows this because there's no indication that they told him where they were going. Either way, the headmaster doesn't believe his story and thinks he's just hallucinating from his head trauma. Back in Peru, it's revealed that Goldfinger has invented a machine called the Earthcracker that can create earthquakes. He hopes to use it to find the location of El Dorado, because, he loves gold. After threatening to kill Lotta using the Earthcracker, her father tells Goldfinger where he believes El Dorado is hidden. Oddjob then uses a machine on a mountain cliff, and sure enough, they find El Dorado. That's when Oddjob sees James Bond Jr. hanging off a cliff, and he throws his hat towards him, knocking him down. See, this is why James Bond Jr. asked IQ if he had anything that could stop Oddjob's hat, because he knew something like this was going to happen. And what's interesting is that IQ had mentioned that the rope was very strong, but I guess it wasn't strong enough for Oddjob's hat. Again, I want to mention Oddjob's appearance in this show compared to his character from the film. In the film, he's wearing a three-piece suit with a top hat. In the animated series, he has a top hat, it's purple, and he's wearing a neon tracksuit. He has a gold chain with his initials on it. He has gloves, white tennis shoes, and aviator glasses. So by this point, it becomes very obvious that this animated series exists in some alternate James Bond universe. Because when Goldfinger meets James Bond Jr. for the first time, he doesn't know who he is until James Bond Jr. says, "Oh, my name is Bond, James Bond Jr." And Goldfinger comments that, oh, he sees a family resemblance. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen Goldfinger, at the end of the movie, he ends up getting killed by being sucked out of an airplane. But honestly, I don't really mind that they're not sticking to the films when it comes to this series, because I like the idea of using characters from the movie, like Goldfinger, Jaws, Dr. No, and Knick Knack. Now there's some dialogue in this episode that almost sounds exactly like a scene from the movie. Bond asks Goldfinger, now that he has found El Dorado, what does he plan to do? Give guided tours? Goldfinger responds with, "No, I intend to use the laser to melt the gold." Now, obviously the way that these lines are delivered is supposed to sound like the scene from Goldfinger where he has Bond tied to a table and James Bond asks, "Do you expect me to talk?" And he goes, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die." We then cut to James Bond Jr., Lotta, and her father, all tied by Oddjob on top of a giant golden statue. The Earthcracker then turned on and is starting to melt the statue. James Bond Jr. makes the joke, "Things are about to heat up." As Goldfinger begins to melt the gold, he turns it into bricks. But they're not like normal rectangular bricks, these look like giant pizza slices. IQ and Tracy see that Bond, Lotta, and her father are in trouble and are trying to figure out a way to save them. That's when IQ uses one of the battery grenades to blow up some boulders on a cliff, which distracts Goldfinger and his soldiers. James Bond Jr. is then able to use the grappling hook on his watch to tilt the statue over, which allows Lotta and her father to escape, and James Bond Jr. to slide down towards the Earthcracker. He then activates a high-frequency pitch that's on the device that stops not only Oddjob mid-hat throw, but everyone else, including his friends. He then aims the Earthcracker towards Goldfinger's melting device, causing another earthquake that destroys it, the gold, and also the entryway to El Dorado. When Oddjob gets his footing back, he tosses his hat towards the laser, only for it to be destroyed. Another hat bites the dust. As the rubble comes down, Goldfinger and Oddjob are presumed dead. Now, spoiler, they're not dead. They do come back in a later episode. Lotta's father mentioned that his daughter was right, that El Dorado will be lost for good. James Bond Jr. then shows Lotta's father that he was able to save what looks like an Oscar before the whole place was destroyed. He then tells IQ that he was actually the person that saved the day because his devices actually worked. IQ mentions that that's nice of him to say that he gets all the credit, but it doesn't mean he gets the girl, saying that James Bond Jr. has the golden touch. And there you have it, that is episode 2, Earthcracker. Now let's talk about the comic adaptation. The artist of the comic was Mario Capaldi. Mario Capaldi also created many of the cover arts for the James Bond Jr. comics. He also drew other Marvel comic adaptations of Zorro, Barbie, Thundercats, and Care Bears. He also drew a version of Harry Potter and his friends that was used for a BBC presentation. Sadly, in 2004, he passed away. To look at more of Mario Capaldi's artwork, check out his website. I really enjoyed the ads in this comic as well. The first one was an advertisement for Tiny Toon Adventures on NES, which I own. I actually own the original Tiny Toon game on NES and its sequel. As like the first issue, there are advertisements for Dungeons and Dragons, but what they also have are advertisements for really obscure Marvel comics around that time, including one called Defenders of Dinotron City. This looks really cool. One of the superheroes looks like a Superman type character, but his head is actually a rocket that he's able to shoot off his shoulders. There's then a half man, half hammer, bellhop monkey with banana grenades, and all these characters are standing on a pile of destroyed robot body parts. It's really cool. Check it out. If you can find it, Defenders of Dinotron City. There's also an ad for WCW, the Toxic Avengers comic book series, and for a Marvel comic book series that I never knew existed, but I'm not surprised, Kid and Play. I mean, if Disney Adventure Magazine can have a 98 Degrees comic, why can't Kid and Play have one too? Now, there are some differences in the comic than in the episode. First off, the cover shows James Bond Jr., Lotta, and her father all sliding down the golden statue. Now, in the episode, only James Bond Jr. slides down. However, this cover is really cool, and I actually would have preferred this happening in the episode than what we got. Also, Trevor is completely omitted. Also, unlike the episode, Goldfinger never uses the Earthcracker on Lotta. He just threatens to. Now here's the biggest difference. In the comic, after Oddjob used his hat to knock James Bond Jr. down to the ground, it cuts to him waking up already on top of the golden statue, and it alludes that Goldfinger already knows who James Bond Jr. is. This is a huge difference, because like I said in the episode, Goldfinger has no idea who James Bond Jr. is. Just like the end of the episode, Bond does give all the credit to IQ, but Lotta says, no, it was all you, James, nobody else. So there you have it, episode 2 of James Bond Jr. Earthcracker and issue number 3 of the Marvel Comics, also entitled Earthcracker. On the next episode of the James Bond Jr. podcast, I'll be talking about episode 3, The Chameleon. Again, if you want to see some of my James Bond Jr. merchandise that I own, you can check out my Instagram at Varnell Retro Vintage Collections. You can also see pictures of the other random things I have here in my office. I'm Brian Varnell for Varnell Retro and Vintage Collections, and remember, danger lurks within every shadow.